Wonderful. All right.
All right, so we're getting into one of my favorite old Greek guys. It's old Aristotle there, and Aristotle I have much more respect for than Plato. I have a lot of respect for Plato, but when it comes to the followers of Socrates, Aristotle's definitely the top of my sort of number one top of the pops chart. So we're going to start on the Nicomachean ethics, and this is one of the very distinct differences between Aristotle and Plato. So we're going to go through comparison. What is happiness? Aiming towards good, defining the role of external goods towards happiness. What is a complete life and how does it represent happiness? Is mere pleasure happiness, and how is pleasure a part of a good life? And who and what can be happy? So interesting little bits and pieces. Before we start, this is our introduction. And does anyone remember what the first bit of this work happens to be? What is the first topic?
Well, it's pertaining to what is the goal. Go ahead, Brendan. Yeah.
Well, it's like what is good and what is happiness, and looking at what is someone, how does someone achieve happiness in their life?
And I better actually share the screen, better I not? Share screen. Otherwise, everyone will have to put up with our faces. Okay, so I take it we can see that now?
Yes.
All right, so there we go. As I said, table of contents, that's it there. That's what we're covering today, and let's get into the topic. Okay, so Aristotle was quite famous over in the medieval times. He sort of replaced Plato as works got found from the Islamic scholars that had protected them and repopulated everything. Now, the reason for this is that Aristotle and Plato and all of the other Greeks were integrated and translated within the Islamic sort of golden age, the Islamic Renaissance, which was before the European one. And this is an incredibly important aspect of what occurred, because after the Carolingians, the others in Central Europe that took control, they didn't care too much about the nature of the Greek and Roman texts. They saw it as pagan, and they moved away from teaching any of this. That got back into it at around the time of Aquinas and others, who suddenly started going, "Ooh, this stuff's interesting," and applying it to Christian medieval thought. But for a while, everyone abandoned it. So we're going to focus on what was considered the ultimate by Aristotle of human happiness, which is fulfillment and well-being. It isn't just, I feel good, I'm pleasurable. It isn't, I've had a hit of drugs. It isn't that momentary good. Rather, it is the fundamental growth and well-being of an individual. So it is can't even say it properly, humanidia. My Greek pronunciation is horrible, so you'll please forgive me. I can write it, but I just can't get my tongue around it. I keep trying, and I sound absolutely ridiculous every single time. So if someone else wants to look that up and try and say it, and later I could probably type it in the thing and spell it out, but for the moment I'm not going to pronounce it anymore and get myself even more silly. So it is fundamental growth and happiness. It is more what later scholars like Mill would argue an utilitarian, not simple utilitarian, common good, not like some people go, I'm excited because I've had a day at the monster truck rally and got totally pissed. It is, how do we get the pinnacle of what is good? How do we find our place? The Humanisir, stupid, I can't even pronounce Indian stuff. Anyway, the famous Indian text that I'm not going to pronounce right at this moment also goes into the same sort of different thing. How we actually get it. So, okay, BHAGAVAD space GITA. Gitter. My pronunciation of this is terrible, so you'll forgive me, but I spelt it.
Okay.
So that other Indian text with Krishna, etc., is also the same sort of thing. The one good, the pinnacle of goodness, the thing that we're meant to be here for. So it is the goal of something that we can achieve. What are we able to do? What is our best place in the universe? Something that others, such as Marcus Aurelius in Meditations, also saw. Many of the Stoics saw this. The concept that we can find our place in the universe. And that's what the ultimate good is. So Aristotle looks at a universal underlying factor, the happiness of what makes humanity, not merely through his definition, what all of us seek. And again, we've got this problem of definitions, don't we? I mean, what have we had all through this? We've had different definitions. Before we can even start really debating something, we need to define it. And this is why a lot of people sit there and go, us philosophers never get round to doing anything, because we sit there arguing what a definition is, like I'm trying to do with network nodes at the moment on Bitcoin. I mean, I thought I defined it really well in section 5 of my white paper. Well, this is what they do, but people then go, oh, well, it can be a node if it only does one of these. No, it can't. So happiness needs to be defined. And the concept in that American document over there, calling for the pursuit of happiness, follows from this. So we have these individuals, the Jeffersons, the sort of, let's see, the what's his name? The Adams, the guy between the first and third president, President Adams there. These individuals who sought to both create and oppose the Federalist Papers and the definition of pursuit of happiness that Jefferson wanted to instill isn't anything other than an Aristotelian form of happiness. It is the ultimate being and virtue, not, hey, I can get a hit. No, it is, how do I make myself better over time? Something that we don't really think about now. We go, how can I be happy? But we don't think about the cost of happiness or what we need to do. So Aristotle said, only at the end of our life can we look back and see whether it has been truly happy and good. Any idea why you think that he did that?
You said it was
Well, I
only at
think
the end.
At
Sorry.
the end.
Let me just correct. Yeah, at the end of his life. Okay, yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Brendan.
No, at the end of anyone's life.
Of anyone.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because he sort of goes on to say that happiness isn't really an instantaneous state of mind. It's much more an accumulation of acts and outcomes and sort of the totality of what you've experienced up to a point. And it's only when you can look back on everything that's happened to you that you can determine whether or not you are happy. And he then, I thought it was good that you mentioned pleasure. He looks a lot at pleasure and really he's saying that, look, pleasure is not happiness, and a life that is spent in the pursuit of only pleasure will not end in happiness. And so really it's something that accumulates over life. And it's not until we sort of get to the end that we can say, well, that person was happy in what they did and who they were all the way up to the end of their life. And the example that you gave in the reading for this week of the Egyptian, I forget his name now, but who's thought he was happy because he was wealthy and went on to experience this overwhelming tragedy, wealthy and powerful, and had this horrible tragedy take place shortly thereafter, was a great example of someone who thought, I must be happy because of who I am and where I am and what I have, but whose life ended up being quite unhappy.
Yes. Again, we come to hubris.
Yes.
Hubris is that unrelenting arrogance, that extra arrogance that even the gods can't stand. So that was, for instance, if we remember the tale of Achilles, not that we've covered that in this course yet, but Achilles dragged the body of Hector round and round until even the gods were sad, despoiling all of that and wouldn't give it back to his father right till the end, and taking it to that point of rubbing things in so far that everyone groans. So both of these authors, both of Plato and Aristotle, dealt with morals and ethics. Now, we see vast differences between the two. Now, one of the things I'm going to also mention here is I'm going to be covering a lot of different works through this course or series of courses. And this is, in a way, what I mean, my sort of vision of the Western canon. Now, it's not everything, of course, because if you take the Western canon, you go into the Loeb Library and all sorts of things like that, and it will take 20, 30 years. But the order of which I'm doing this is important, and other people will start learning as they read more, that it's not just those things that I say touch me and are most important to me, some of the ones which, of course, I'm doing now, but it is also finding those things that touch you and teach you. So examples of all this, of course, are other books that might find something inside you that really teaches, whether it's Gilgamesh or von Hoffman's letters and papers from prison around World War II. We've covered others like Euripides and Asclepius in Aresta, and as a side thing for attached to the plays we've already done. But maybe these other plays touch you more. The Divine Comedy, which we'll do, different works of Shakespeare. Some of these will touch different people different ways because each of us have our own lives, our own interaction of the world, and our own views of what is good and bad. And in exploring this, we get the differences. So first of all, we have the differences here between Plato. Plato is dialogue. Aristotle is more logical and systematic. I like Aristotle because I'm an Aspie, and like many people who are scientists or Aspies or both, it's easier, it's logical, it's structured. And anyone with OCD will love Aristotle a lot more than Plato because Plato jumps all over the place. I mean, and for people like me, although I enjoy Plato, I find him very frustrating. I don't know if any of you have found that.
Yeah, could I comment on that? Because I noticed exactly the same thing, and I thought it was funny that you like Aristotle better because I couldn't help to think that Aristotle is the more Craig-like of the two. So Aristotle is far more. And he's sorry, say it again.
His beard's neater. If you look at the two pictures there, he's at least had a haircut. He's tidy. Whereas old Plato, there's a bit of a hippie.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think so. My default way of doing it would be more like Aristotle. Having read this one and then having read, it reminds me of. I don't know if you're going to cover this in your new course here, but earlier you had us read Adam Smith's book, The Theory of Moral Sentiment. So I'm like, oh, this is like Aristotle's version of that book is what this reminds me of. And it's much more analytical and mathematical and, sort of strict and logical in these things. But anyway, so I default to doing it that way, but I love the dialogue approach as well. So they're complementary to each other, but it's interesting to compare them like that.
It takes a lot sort of to get into both of them. That's one of the difficulties people have. If you're more into Aristotle, then that will become easier. But if you're more into the dialogue, you'll find Aristotle probably boring, vice versa. So as I've got there, the position makes it more difficult to actually pull Plato's perspective out. You have to read much more to delve into it. But over time, you start to see what he's trying to say. And the characters don't expose his views directly, but indirectly, you can see what he's extracting people. You can see the focus. Now, the difference with Aristotle, of course, is it's nice and clear and easy. Aristotle just goes, blah, 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 point, point, point. This is it. Platonic dialogues, you read through and you jump like in normal speech from topic to topic, and the methodology used is more phenomenological. Whereas Aristotle there is a classifier. He's like Darwin. He sits there and goes, this beetle is different than this beetle because this one has 1 millimeter on average longer wings, and this one has a shiny carapace, that sort of thing. In case you didn't notice, Darwin really loved beetles. If you actually read outside of his main thing, Darwin spent half his life documenting beetles. He was a real beetle lover, but that's a different thing. So what is happiness? Well, let's get into the topic. Now, Aristotle poses a question for us right at the start of his work. He really starts, what is happiness? Now, do you remember what the beginning of the Republic was about? We read the first books. What was that covering?
Justice. You mean as contrasted with happiness? Is that what you were referring to? Like
yes.
It's about just understanding the nature of justice, which is not unrelated to happiness. There's a bit of overlap there.
So we start with justice in Plato and then move towards virtue and how to have a good life. Whereas it's the other way around with Aristotle. It's how can I be complete as a human, and then everything else will fall into place. So they're different, and the order of what they do is different. And that brings about a different sort of outcome. In Plato, as we saw, it becomes the state and the collective. We have to be part of society no matter what. Aristotle became more of the individualist. So remember, the difference here is what form of sort of life and happiness is best. Now, that doesn't mean, like some people think, that go out there, do whatever you want. Remember, this is a system of virtue ethics. So something about building yourself and your character. So collective state is the best good to Plato. The individual is the best good. The sense of moral well-being and virtue that can be developed is Aristotle's good. Plato is open and questioning and doesn't really document anything of the topic. It's dialectic. It's going back and forwards with different opposing views. Aristotle investigates methodologically. Aristotle could be a modern scholar, and many of the scholastic processes that our universities today have developed from really took Aristotle and treated how he writes and sort of creates works of literature and also works of science and works of math and logic, and basically uses those as a template and foundation. So Plato goes over aspects of this like courage, temperament, friendship, etc., and reflects on happiness. Whereas Aristotle, it's very just out there and apparent right from the beginning. So Plato goes again into some ethical topics, but he tries to get you to develop it by questioning and reflection. Whereas we have a systematic approach by Aristotle. Okay, this person has been happy. Why are they happy? What makes you happy, etc. So very different approach. So aiming towards good. Now, if we're going to seek goodness, if we're going to try and find a way of developing that, then we need to actually think about what good is. So we begin by noting every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. So this is Aristotle's primary focus. Now, this also goes into a lot of more what people would be classical liberal or libertarian authors, not so much where people have gone these days. People have gone out into weird and wonderful anarchist sort of things where it's gone full circle, and rather than individuals in a society, it's let's do whatever the hell we want. And that's forgetting the value of virtue and happiness. So good action derived through an active life, not merely the good or pleasure achieved through a simple query. Now, I want you to think about one of the American founding fathers, And there's a dichotomy in Jefferson, for instance. Jefferson was very much your small state liberal. He didn't want a federal system. He wanted to maintain the system of states where power was decentralized and not controlled. Yet equally, it was Jefferson who wanted to bring in the concept of a education for all Americans, that the state would mandate that had to happen. Now, that can seemingly be a contradiction, but when you think about it, the underlying aspect is that if people don't understand virtue, if people don't have that foundation, then are they going to be able to achieve happiness? They don't need to be equally rich, but there needs to be an access to be able to get knowledge, to be able to have an education. So this doesn't mean any different, black, white, male, female, everyone should. So Aristotle argues that the end of ethics is the greatest good. We want something that is morally right. And this is something that is also taken up by later scholars, as I said, like Menger, the Austrians, Mises, and all of these neo-Aristotelian philosophies ended up being part of the Austrian economic foundation. Not we can do whatever we want, but there can be a set of rules that people can create ourselves. We don't need to necessarily have everything ruled, but we need rules. So again, we need to seek what the ultimate good is. What is it we're desiring? It can't just be, I want more power, I want more money. Why are we doing this? What is it, our aim that we're trying to get? If you think about it, it becomes a bit pathological. If I just want more power to have more power, if I want more money to have more money, what is the end? There's never any real end, and it's not even the desire people want. So if you want more money and more power, it is to be the most powerful. But why are you doing that? So Aristotle would drill down into that, and in a way, he had a modern post-James type psychology, that James was a psychologist a little bit before Freud. Many of our modern theories derived from his, so much more than Freud's. But Aristotle goes down into this, if we can accept some end in itself, it's good. He noted that it is really about focusing on finding truth. The idea that if we have an infinite regression, then there's no end. So we need to be able to find something. Not I'm doing this so that I can A to get B, B to get C, C to get D, etc. We need to find something that we're aiming for its own sake. So if we make such an inquiry, we really need to find something that is what we're really looking for at the end of our journey. Okay, so we can't sit there and just go, I want money. Why do you want money? Because money buys me goods. Why do you want goods? Because goods give me pleasure. Why, etc. So if you start going down that, then you haven't sought the end.
You can even go even more super specific than that. You know, like I'm hungry, I want a sandwich. Well, then I can pursue the art of making a sandwich to make sure that that's the best possible sandwich. So what do? Do I go and get 100 best Italian cookbooks and learn which tomatoes to buy and how to grow basil and how to make the best possible sandwich? Or do I just make the sandwich, accept that it's not quite going to be the best sandwich in the world, but that it's going to satisfy my hunger, which is going to mean that I'm happy to be able to go and pursue other things. And so you've got to sort of also realize that it is not always, you can't pursue the total end of anything like that and still achieve happiness. You've got to have a sort of a breadth of things that you do. And it's, I think that was one of the things that he sort of explained, I thought, quite well in the book.
So I will say that's a very Epicurean example. Epicurus sort of not being represented very well these days. He wasn't out for just pleasure, etc. Rather, again, to find the best that you can. So no, you're not going to spend a month trying to make the perfect sandwich. What you're going to actually do is you're going to make the best sandwich you can now, and then maybe before your next sandwich, think about where you might get recommendations for a better one, etc.
That's right.
Etc. So we discuss in this some of the aspects of happiness. So there's a few quotes there. I can let you read them, but really it's something good in itself, as I keep saying. It doesn't require anything more. It stands all on its own. So again, there's no regress. And if you're aiming for something, so why do you want to be educated? Well, there's going to be some goal, or is it itself? So I'm at that crazy point where there is no, I mean, there are training aspects. I continuously train myself and learn new skills. I'm doing more courses in data science at the moment to improve some of those areas of what I'm doing based on new techniques, etc., because this damn field of computer science keeps moving. And every time I think I'm up with it, someone has new stuff. Which isn't a bad thing, but it just keeps me busy. Now, conversely, the reason I do further education is to improve myself. Doesn't always work, and I can be an overly grumpy bastard many times. Sometimes I go off what people think is the deep end because I don't just hammer the result home. I basically get a sledgehammer and turn it into mince, but that's part of why we try and work on ourselves and improve. So we don't have a definition of happiness. We don't have a single outcome. Just as I don't have a definition of what is educated, I can keep going in there and going, but I can learn more, I can read more, I can, etc. It is something that is functioning on its own, and it's going to be different for everyone. So an example of a good is a nail. The good of a nail is in holding planks together. So if that nail is holding your floorboards down and they're not slipping and they're not creaking, that is a good nail. Simple explanation for that one. So what is a good man? What is and I'm using this in the traditional sense because I'm not woke. By man, I mean man, woman, hermaphrodite, I don't really care, but whoever. So what is the function of a good human? What is the function of a person? What is a good person? And in that, we need to think about what is a good life? Why am I here? What can I do? And if we, again, think of old Marcus Aurelius, who I mentioned earlier, old Marcus Aurelius there saw himself as, look, I would rather be a philosopher, but I just happen to be an emperor. I mean, damn. But for him, it might sound, we go, wow, he's an emperor. But he wasn't like his son Commodus. And if you think about it for a moment, like people would go up to him and go, Commodus, do you really want to leave power to that guy? I mean, he's a bit iffy and yeah, I don't know if you want to do that. But like the analogy with Jupiter, the god, and his son Mars, Mars being the god of war, always causing problems. Both cases, it's, well, I love my son. So we can again see that people can be out there as a good emperor and not always be wise in everything, although they know problems. So in the case of Marcus Aurelius, he might sit there going, I want to be a philosopher, but he understood that protecting the realm, protecting the empire was what made him a good emperor. And he was a very good emperor, although he went to war a lot. And some people go, how terrible he went to war. He did that to protect the borders, to protect his people. And remember, this is a area of Europe where you could go from London or Londinium down to some of the areas on the borders of India and speak one language and be able to talk to everyone, Latin, sometimes Greek, and have one set of money and be safe. That's not something we even have
One
now.
set of laws.
One set of laws, where Paul, basically, as he was being beaten up, could sit there and go, but I'm a Roman. And they'd pull out his papers and go, oh, God, you're a Roman. And the tribune would go, oh, please don't report me. I'm actually a good policeman, and brought him up to the governor, etc., etc. So didn't necessarily work out well for him at the end, but at least he had a little trial and had justice done properly. I guess a way of looking at it would be, imagine if you're giving a lecture. Imagine you're sitting there in a university hall or something like this. You're in front of all the students, and some guy walks in and starts going, actually, you're wrong. My name's Paul, or Craig in my case, and everything you're teaching is just wrong, and starts lecturing in the theatre. Paul did that a little bit, and imagine what would happen today. We'll sit there going, oh, free speech, but there's a time and place for free speech, and invading a private space and taking over a lecture probably isn't the best place, and the security guards would come and drag you out. So old Paul did the equivalent of what we'd have with the security guards in a Berkeley theatre today, and got dragged out several times. So let's go back to this. A happy person does not merely have a good time. A happy person achieves good. So the definition of what we saw in Human I'm not even going to try and pronounce it again. I probably will, and I'll sound just as stupid every freaking time. A enjoyment and pleasure is desirable. It's nice, but they're not good in themselves. They're not bad either, but they're passing events. It's a life of virtue and not merely pleasure that leads to happiness. So it's something that we have to strive to achieve. Now, contrary to what people say, that's something what I do try and strive to achieve. I might be completely shit at it at times, but at least I understand that and I try and work on it. Sometimes I'm worse than shit at trying to achieve these things, and I still have a temper, and I still not anywhere near as perfect as, well, not even close to, but I understand that. And like Aristotle says here, it's a moral quantity that incorporates the virtue that we gain over our entire lifetime. It is the part of a complete and happy, satisfying life. Something that even others that, like Benjamin Franklin there, would have taught us, not just pragmatism, but developing ourselves. So old Ben Franklin had 13 different virtues, and he would basically go through week by week. And as you guess, with 52 weeks, he would do this 4 times a year each season. He would do measuring one thing. So he would pick something, the classic virtues that none of us would really care about, like prudence, and think about it. Thrift. Did I spend too much on my coffee today, or over tip? That sort of thing. And he would note it down and keep a record so that he knew where he went wrong. I've done some of that as well, and I'm planning on getting back into it, because as an example, in Australia at one stage, I started a swear jar with my wife and family, and after paying for a really lavish, expensive holiday, which I'm not kidding, I slowly swore less. I every time, I mean, it was a very big jar, and after a while, the reminder of how big the jar was actually helped, and actually several jars.
Full it was.
How full it was and how many there were, and having to take them into the bank as, well, didn't have a wheelbarrow, but practically, sort of reminded me enough that I stopped doing it. Unfortunately, even if you stop doing these things, habits come back. So it's something I'm going to have to try and work on again.
Well, I guess happiness could be that you get to the end of your life and you look back and you're like, look, I really came at that problem, and although I didn't get all the way, I made a substantial improvement in myself, and I built a new habit and a new outlook, and that's a measure that you can go by.
Craig, can I ask your opinion before you go on? I have just a related question, just of what your opinion is, which is on just defining happiness. Do you believe that Aristotle, do you believe there would be a way to define this more clearly than what Aristotle is doing here, or do you believe that basically Aristotle's doing as good as you can to address that question?
I believe he's actually done quite well. I think we can go much further, and through the course as we go into other philosophers, we'll actually get further on this topic. Now, that will be a combination of not only like Mill and others who are utilitarians, as much as I hate to say it, even Kant, K-A-N-T. I'm not always a fan of Kant, but that's personal preference, and some of the fluffiness that he chucks in there ends up being a social justice warrior at the end, and a bit like John Rawls, not thinking through everything. Lack of pragmatism, but that we'll get to that one day. But I think in the aspect of building virtue over time, I think he's completely correct. I think it is really about something that isn't a momentary thing. It isn't sort of pleasure. So the concept of pursuit of happiness in this is not, can I find how to be more satisfied for the moment, but really, how do I build virtue in myself? And that incorporates a number of areas that I need to improve. I need to improve my social skills. I don't need to improve my work ethic or my study ethic. Those are both down pat. I can study the hell out of things, but interacting with people is still my difficulty. So like everyone, we have strengths and weaknesses. And the happy man still needs to have goods and possessions. So Aristotle is a little bit different to Plato in that. Plato was a proto-collectivist communist who would basically get rid of all belongings and even have everyone in a big communal love fest straight out of
family.
Yeah, I'm going to rent out my wife because I don't really have a wife type thing. But yeah, I mean, that's Plato. Aristotle actually understands that people want things, possessions. They like and invest time into stuff. There are bits and pieces that I quite like having. There are, for instance, just to go across the room here, old books. Like in this case, I've had this book for quite some time. It's I've got it out again because of a dissertation I'm writing, and the book is by Nelson, The Idea of Usury. Now, it may seem a stand like something that's a bit obscure now, but some of the concepts behind finance and what is right and what is wrong, and that are interesting even now. So, but that's a different thing, and we'll get to that at a different time. So, what is a complete life, and how does that represent happiness? So, a complete life is something that is fulfilled. I mean, old sort of Buddha there would have been quite happy with some of this sort of stuff. We got Solon, of course, That's the guy that you were talking about before, Solon, Croesus, and the others. And
Yes.
that's in Herodotus and his histories. So I've taken a whole pile of quotes and nicked all those because, hey, I'm allowed to. Copyright's over. I mean, if you consider 75 years past the death of the author, and no, in this case, it's not actually the author who is currently alive, from way back then or anything like this, or it is the translator. And luckily, in the text I have and ripped off, the authors died at least 300 years ago, so we're all good. Copyright don't apply anymore. If you've been dead for a few centuries, then like Shakespeare, copy away. Of course,
I just quickly, I thought it was interesting that you mentioned Buddha, because one thing I kept thinking as I was reading this book, he talks in each of the books where he's talking about the different aspects of the good and virtue and what we kind of seek in life. He's talking about how there's extremes of each of these things, and that the way to find happiness is to zero in on sort of a middle path or a middle way. And I'm a little bit fascinated by some of those concepts in Buddhism, and it's always about finding that middle path. Don't go without, but don't want everything. Find that point where your need is sated, and that is the way to be happy. And he goes a long way into that sort of idea in the book, which I quite like.
Now, this is an interesting aspect of things that I'll slightly divert from our main topic with. If we look at Indian philosophy with the Bhagavad Gita.
Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah, that one. That I'm not having any luck pronouncing tonight. Sometimes it comes out right, but tonight it isn't going to. Then the concept there of Krishna as both God of good and evil and all things, that it mirrors some of the concepts of fate in Greco-Roman culture, mirrors some of the concepts of Dharma. Karma and Dharma are actually similar in some ways. So the Taoist philosophies, which if you go back to the early start before they started chucking magic and other hogwash into it, back where it was philosophy and not having spells and stuff, and it did for about 4 or 5 centuries. It didn't have spells, and suddenly someone started doing the Wizard of Oz bit to attract followers, I guess. Sorry if anyone's a Taoist and into waving pretty sparkly wands. But the early Taoist philosophy was very similar in that way as well. So now I've chucked in the old Solon and Croesus there. And remember, we have someone who believes that they have a happy life. Everything's good. Lots of women, mind, money, and song, and then it all goes away. Didn't work out quite something that could be there. So Aristotle sees happiness as not something that comes and goes. It can be built up over time, but as you become a good person, someone who has inner virtue, then it's not really something that can be taken away from you. Remember old Socrates right at the beginning of our series. Socrates there died calmly. He died understanding that, look, I'm going to keep doing this. You have to kill me. So be it. And we can look at that and go, what the hell is this guy thinking? He had a good life. That's it. Family's taken care of. Students are okay. Yeah. So,
Craig, could I ask you another question about just your view on this? Because the way that you're describing this building happiness is similar to something you said the other day about creating your own soul. So like in your language, like, if you create your own soul over time, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, say it however you intend here, but is that a similar idea? Is that the same thing as what Aristotle is saying, and or is that a different idea?
It is very similar, which differs quite a lot from old Marcus Aurelius, who was a Stoic, of course. Marcus Aurelius believed that your soul existed while you're alive, and then in death it just reverted to atoms and the end. Get over it. Whereas Aristotle and others believe that there's something more enduring. The starts with B, Gita, would also put that where a spark of the divine in Krishna. In the Bhagavad Gita, like Krishna would effectively, an atom of Krishna would be our entire universe, and we are just a spark of that little tiny bit, and that is the unbounded sort of infinity of God to in that society. But even then, as we die, we pass back into sort of the whole. So, but I'm more of a Christian sort of Protestant belief, which is there's this spark of the divine in all of us, but we have to build it and change it from a spark into a fire, so to speak. So we don't want that little spark to die out. We start with this spark of something human, and we can build it into what Aristotle and others have done, a bonfire of virtue and goodness and a life worth living, if that makes sense.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
that
but
makes-
and then all the it makes sense and it sounds beautiful. And is that happiness to do that?
Aristotle would argue yes. Then,
Okay.
I mean, there are other arguments as well. I mean, what I do and what I go through, I was talking to Stefan today, and you could argue that my life is, to some at least, and many who won't admit it, a life to be admired. It's a life to be respected, but it's not a life that many people would want. I mean, I study constantly, I do degrees constantly, I'm working, I'm basically don't have much downtime, etc., and I build and I create, and then when I'm finished doing that, I build and create some more. And what is the end? I will build and create some more. Now, I guess in a way, like a Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, you would argue that is not necessarily a life that you want. It's not a life to be envied, to be desired. Not many people are going to go out there and wish, hey, that guy, he achieved a lot, but he had a struggle through life and he kept working at it. I wish I could do that. I mean, it's not generally a way you look at it. You don't sit there and go, God, that guy struggled his whole life. I really respect him. And then you don't go, I wish I was like that. Do you now? I mean, you look at the guy with the nice, easy life where no problems, and you go, wow, that's a life I'd love. Look how good everything is for that person. And yeah, not my choice, but anyway.
Yeah, it's happiness almost, it's a state of being that you kind of build in your life. And one of the truths of life is that none of us are born equal. We all are born into different circumstances with different resources. And it's really the application of those resources as we move forward through each of our own lives that takes us on that journey. And as you say, some people like yourself want to spend their entire time in building knowledge, in building systems, in achieving things, and that makes you happy. And whereas some people prefer to spend their time, on pursuits of a different kind. but at the same time, it's always, I think the one thing that Aristotle is saying in this book is that we must always be cautious to be introspective and to understand why we are pursuing those things, and to ensure that we are taking the correct steps that, if things tip back in another direction in our life, that we won't simply be without anything that we like, or any form of enjoyment. And I think it's reading this book, the one thing that it's done for me is it's sort of given me some new tools to look at the way I approach things and the way I've set up my life to really ensure that I have that balance a little better. So,
yeah, I mean, it's something that is always part of an introspective life, the examined life, as Plato would say. In this, we can't just assume that everything's right. We need to attempt to fix and improve over time. So is mere pleasure happiness, and how is pleasure a part of the good life? I mean, while I've said that it's not a goal, it's also something that is part of life. So according to old Aristotle, his view of pleasure and happiness is contrary to what most argue would be happiness. So to judge from the lives men lead, most men, and men of the most vulgar type, seem not without some ground to identify good or happiness with pleasure. So as Aristotle said, most people will sit there and go, oh, happiness, that's pleasurable. But that's something very different to what old Aristotle argues. So pleasure is not an evil or something bad, but it's not one of the external goods. It's not something that you should have as an end in itself. If you have pleasure, if you have a nice meal, then that doesn't solve anything. Tomorrow, you're going to need more pleasure and another nice meal. I mean,
yeah.
You certainly want to enjoy company with people, and you can build relationships. Having a good meal can help strengthen sort of the enjoyment you have with other people in society, and bring about changes in relationships and but it's not.
Pleasure is momentary. Pleasure
Exactly.
is something that happens in a sort of a peak moment. It's a dinner with friends. It's an orgasm. It's whatever it is. You cannot have that in perpetuity throughout your whole life. You must have the rest.
Exactly.
And so, yeah.
So, as I was saying, not an end in life, but it has a place in a happy life. So the converse, the person who is in pain and agony and being tortured, well, they're not going to have a happy life, are they? I mean, old Solon and Chris say, well, that's not a story of a happy life. It's, hey, I've been virtuous, I've studied a lot, and this guy decided to possibly flay me alive. Well, I'm sorry, while your skin's being taken off, you're not going to be sitting there going, I'm feeling a good life. I mean, so who and what can be happy? Nice little shiny clouds there. Happiness does not fit beings either higher or lower than man or people. So the concept here to Aristotle is animals can't truly be happy and gods can't truly be happy. The reason for this is not that they don't feel pleasure. And people go, my dog, but no, to Aristotle, your dog doesn't feel happy. Your dog feels momentary pleasure. Your dog doesn't reflect. Your dog doesn't have language and communicate. And no dog is sort of reflective in that way. And no dog has ever created philosophy. I mean, sorry, not even Snoopy. So, but equally gods, or God, or the gods, or to Aristotle, of course, polytheistic, they don't have happiness either. It's not the same type of thing. It's not reflective. Doesn't mean that they don't have something else. I've never been a god, so I can't answer that one, especially not a Greco-Roman one. And they had a whole lot of very human traits, especially old Zeus going around with all sorts of things and cavorting all over the place. But is the chief good of an animal, is that different or the same of humanity? And I'm sorry, but the chief good for a dog or a cat are very different to those of people. I mean, they might want to be patted, they might want pleasure, but, well, I'm sorry. I've never seen any creations by any animal by choice. No architecture, no art. And we can sit there going, it's only art. Well, no, it's not. It's a difference. It's a quantitative and qualitative difference in what we do. So the pleasure principle is not what we're looking at here. Whether we consider something can contemplate and reflect, and are we introspective at times? Can we examine our lives and decide, this is a good, worthwhile, fulfilling life? So this is something we need to think about in creating ourselves and making our soul, growing who we are. It isn't just I'm X or Y, it is how do I become Z? How do I find my way there? And different people in different roles will have different aspects of what makes them good. If you're a carpenter and you want to be a carpenter, then the good for you, the good life, is going to be very different to an accountant. A good accountant has a different set of values, different ethics, virtues, etc. Both cases should aim at work that is good, work that is proper, work that is complete, work that is fulfilled. But the nature of the work is different in each case. So, why are ethics not an exact science? I mean, this is the first question that we need to think about here. Why can't we just come up with a solution? We had our proto-scientist, not Democritus in this case, but Aristotle, sitting there going, I am going to systematize ethics. And yet, they're still open questions.
Yeah. Could I comment on this one? Because this is like, to me, this is a really central idea here. And I was tempted to ask more questions earlier, but I felt a little long-winded, but I'll come back to it now. There's something with the use of language. So I think that when we read a book like Aristotle's book, that there's actually always limitations there. And something about the pursuit of happiness or whatever is something, it's really difficult to talk about because in a conversation like this, we have to use language, but I think it's beyond language is part of the issue, that you can't just put it into words. And that's where you go beyond creating an exact science, whatever that means. So there is something that would be my answer. The difficulty of defining happiness involves something that you can't express with words.
Well, or at least it takes a lot. So us philosophers might, and I can put that hat on occasionally, I've studied it and I've written a few papers and even been published in the topic, so that'll do for the moment. But we start, when I'm in my philosophy hat, by defining, and we will argue back and forwards over a definition. And people will go, oh, that's a bit wanky. And quite often that happens. But the reality here is, without the definition, we can be arguing at different points, at different ends. And I can be sitting there going, ha, a node is. And the other person can go, well, a node is anything connected to the internet. But we have two different, yeah.
Okay, so let me come back and just say, here's the way that I can express what I think you might be saying, and what might be true here is something like, okay, so maybe we can add more words, because if two people truly sit down to talk about what is the definition of a node, and they're willing to actually hash it out over a while, they may actually end up agreeing after 1 or 2 weeks or something like this, after they hear you explain what it really is and gradually realize what the truth of the matter is. But so maybe more words can actually be a way to resolve that and approximate what the answer is.
If people are not disingenuous and they were open, then yes. Okay. To do this also requires that people are willing to listen and learn and not contradict themselves. Aristotle's a big one here. Aristotle has the logical premise that if there's a contradiction, it's false. Okay, so yes. No contradictions. So this is an important aspect of discovering truth. Now, Aristotle, we're not going through his logic at the moment, but Aristotle's logic held for 2,600 years. Now, it is still a good approximation in mathematics, although now following Russell and other mathematicians and others in the 100 years past Russell, we sit there going, Aristotle had this flaw in his logic and he wasn't quite perfect. Well, get over it. The guy had a series of mathematical constructs that lasted 2,600 years. He's done something right. Now, it wasn't quite perfect, but that's like saying Newton didn't actually get everything right, because this relativity thing will apply to the movement of stars and planets and satellites in space, changing the way that we can represent time. Well, I'm sorry, but for poor old Newton, he had no measurement instruments and he had no way of actually sending anything into space. Although cannons did exist, cannonballs didn't get into orbit. No one made a cannon that big. So this is the point. It is a really, really close approximation. And here's the thing. When we sent people to the moon, we didn't use Einstein. It was too complex. We still use Newtonian calculations. I mean, most people don't realize that, but the complexity of Einstein, which we can do on really big computers, no one did. We got to the moon and back because Newton, not Einstein. So same thing happens here. Now, next question, blessedness and happiness. So we've covered a little bit of happiness. What do you think blessedness might be?
I think blessedness is something that comes from outside, and so you can be blessed with an outstanding body or a great rich, a huge amount of money or something like that. Some sort of luck. Whereas happiness is really what you make from inside yourself. It comes from inside. So blessed is something that comes.
But don't worry, the sort of more equalitarians of us can do a Henry Bergenston and equalize us all. And for those of you who don't know that novel, like if you're too smart, then you could have headsets on that constantly buzz so that you're always distracted. Or if you're really attractive, you could have a mask. Or if you're a really good runner, we put weights on your legs. Everyone's equal. Yay. Because
sounds great.
We want equal outcome, don't we? Like we could do the bed of my pronunciation's terrible. Procrastides. The Greek guy who measured everything, and like if you weren't the right length of the bed, he would either stretch you, and then you'd fit, or he'd cut bits off. Like, oh, your feet are hanging over. I'll just cut them off. Now you fit the bed. Yay. That seems to be an approach that we get by a lot of governments. Unfortunately, rather than letting individuals choose, we set the size of the bed and then we make sure that you fit it. That rack will get you stretched. I don't care if you're 3 foot too short. We'll just stretch you out until either you pop or you fit the bed. So anyway, can a child be happy in the terms defined by Mr. Aristotle there? What do you think?
he kind of does go into this a little bit, and he says that really a young child does not have the capacity yet, or necessarily, I think, more the level of experience needed to look back and be introspective. And it's really through that introspection that we determine that we are happy. And so in that regard, he says no.
Yes, and that's why we need to be educated, why we need to educate people, not just training. And I'm going to emphasize this over and over. Training and education are different. So when I can be educated in some of the fundamentals of statistics, so I understand that aspect of modern society. But if I'm doing ARIMA and GARCH methods, then that is training and not education. So if I'm doing advanced studies in Bayesian technologies using Python so that I can code up a machine learning algorithm to determine some of these, like a Bayesian approach to maybe solving a knapsack problem, then that is not education. That is purely training. If I'm learning to be an electrician, not being educated, being trained. If I'm doing ethics, then I'm being educated. If I'm learning government and community relations to do with interacting with society, I'm being educated. If I'm learning the basis of law and society, educated. If I'm taking that further because I want to be a barrister or a trial attorney over in the US, training. Do we see the distinctions? So this is the importance, what I'll still put on a liberal arts degree. And liberal arts mean the liberal arts, not modern sort of reimaginings of woke culture. This means the era of Locke and others such as him, the era of Enlightenment thought in what is sort of the origins of the liberal arts. It is the freedom arts, the art of teaching free people. Now, this is understanding what is truth. And that changed, of course. We have a different understanding of truth. We have a different understanding of what Locke would have. Our education needs to be different. And in part, that is because old Locke there didn't have the scientific method that we have now. Bacon might have been around, not the lovely tasting stuff that you sizzle on your pan, but Francis Bacon. Bacon was there as a proto-scientist doing a early version of all of this, but our scientific methodology has gone a long, long way. Not talking about scientism. I'm talking about proper analysis of evidence. Aristotle's a very good one for this. He's a systematic systematizer. And I'll say both of those words because he's that OCD'd on this sort of stuff. That's my box. That goes into that box. This gets a little label. I'll put it on that shelf and there's my catalog for it, blah, blah, blah. That would be our person there, our Aristotle. And this is something we need to think about when we're learning how to develop. How do we understand truth? So one, no contradictions. And through this course, we'll try and go into some more of this. But also, how do we understand some of our things now? I've had a few arguments, unfortunately, about this topic. I'm not trying to shoot people down, but for instance, to go on a side thing, with COVID, people argue, oh, you government bad, blah, blah, blah. Here's a simple thing for you. You cannot just use hearsay and anecdote. That is not truth. It might be true in some cases, but you can't use an anecdote and think that it's truth. That is not a path to evidence. You need to demonstrate things properly, show scientific research, show evidence to what you're claiming. And here's the real point of this. If you don't, even if you're right, no one will take you seriously. So all those people who are anti-vax, etc., you can't take non-scientific mumbo jumbo and promote it without ruining your own cause. You can't go out there and oppose things without thinking of alternatives. So you can't simply sit there and say, well, I think it's true. How is that any better than going magic? Demonstrate it statistically, show evidence, show experiments. And there's always these sort of things out there, but show it properly. So if you want to argue, in my case, that Bitcoin nodes connect in a certain way, then you collect evidence. And of course, Twitter's not the best place for this. I mean, I'm sorry, but Twitter is an anti-truth forum. Unfortunately, there isn't a social media platform yet. Ryan might be trying to work on that one, but there isn't yet that will allow anything in truth. And remember, we had our ring of Gyges at the beginning? That old ring of Gyges there. Well, if we're going to have anonymous people, they act like old Gyges. And guess what Gyges did? Everything bad. Not reflective like old Aristotle, and totally different. So now this gets to our question. When should people start to learn about ethics as a topic for youth in society? When did Aristotle do this, and when do you guys think?
I don't remember. Brendan, do you remember what did Aristotle say? Because I have my own thoughts, but I don't remember what Aristotle said.
I'm sure he probably said something. I can't recall it straight away. I didn't quite get to that question last night as I was preparing for this.
Then can I share my answer, because I want to base my answer
certainly
on what you guys are saying here. And I think actually later, and the reason for this is actually because children aren't mature enough at a young age to actually understand these subjects. So you should actually do technical training first, and then the ethical training or ethical education, let's say, second. The reason being, and I'll just give my own frame of reference on this, but when I remember learning a lot of subjects like this when I was younger, I won't go into it, but religious training when I was younger, I didn't understand a lot of these things because I didn't have the life experience yet. And I think that's because I was young, and I think this is what a lot of people experience. I think it should come later. If you do it first, they don't understand. So if you do it later, in other words, let's say at the age of university, so you could do technical training up front, but then university or wherever you place the age, but something like that. When you're an adult, you should do this type of education. But that's my opinion. What do you think, Craig and Brendan?
I think we should start earlier. I'd say high school. I mean, there should be an introduction to civics, and there should be an introduction to government and structure. And then we should build upon that as we go through. So my answer would be we should give some and then build upon it and build upon it. But yes, more heavily focused at the beginning on technical skills. How to write well. It's not education, it's a technical skill, but a necessary skill. How to utilize computers these days. How to understand basic statistical terms. These are all aspects of training that then lead into education and develop further. So, but without the ability to read and write, then we're not really going to be able to even educate ourselves terribly well. We're not going to find those other books out there and learn.
I think it would be possible to start at a very young age, actually teaching kids to be introspective and to identify the good things that they want to pursue, and actually to really build a great foundation from which at that sort of mid-high school age, you could then bring in an ethical education framework and really have a foundation that's already set. And that's not something I think that we do at the moment. I mean, I look at what my kids are learning school, and it's really, I try to teach them, much more in line with this sort of thing, and read much better books, or give them much better books to read. Not that they often want to, but
so we have this dichotomy and contradiction in many people at the moment who believe that they're part of a democracy and that's important, but then they will go, but my vote doesn't matter. Well, I mean, think about it at the extreme. If everyone says my vote doesn't matter, then no one's votes matter. But everyone's vote matters. And there actually, ironically, have been elections that are won by 1 or 2 votes in the past. That doesn't happen all the time. But every individual becomes part of that. So, and it's not just voting. It's also talking and writing and expressing your views. Now, this shouldn't be a medium for attack. Now, to say something controversial on this, the convoy by the Canadian truckers, I'm strongly against that, but not for the reasons people think. I believe those people who are the truckers have a right not to go to work, to strike, but that doesn't mean they block the bridge. Doesn't mean they interfere with the rights and property of another. Now, if they want to get together and stop the supply chain and muck it up, they're right. No one in a free society has the right to make you go to work. No one has the right to take your truck to drive goods. And the argument is, oh, but what if the military does blah? Well, then the military needs to spend a lot of money, and the government needs to take out all that money, and et cetera, and it's not so simple, especially over an extended period of time. It's the difference between being a striker who stops people going in to work, or the striker who just doesn't turn up. And it's one thing to picket, but as soon as you block the door, then you're interfering with other people's rights. And my argument there will be, you have the right to go, no, I'm not going to work. And someone else has the right to go, well, I'm going to anyway. I don't agree with the strike. And for you to determine whether they can or not is wrong. So whether you believe in what those truckers are doing is right or wrong, my argument is how they're doing it is wrong. If they all want to pull up in a public area where you're allowed to park and eat hamburgers for 6 months, and people want to fund them eating hamburgers for 6 months, yay. And yes, that will still have a massive effect because the price of goods and services will go up. The supply of goods in shopping centers will diminish. The supply chain is already fragile. Doing something like that doesn't get the same media response. It doesn't get the same Twitter response. Grow up. Stop thinking about Twitter hits and think about doing something without shitting on other people. That is my answer to that one. So this is what I'm trying to get people to understand. You still don't need to necessarily impact other people's rights or other people's property. You can still make a personal say. And guess what? The government has no comeback. If you go, well, I'm not working and I'm not giving you my damn truck, and they decide to act, there's a big difference. Sending in the military and the police to remove people blockading a bridge is different to seizing property. If you're parked at home and the government comes up and go, we're seizing your truck, that is very different. That is the government impacting your freedom, your rights, your property. That is different to blocking other people and impacting other people. So my 2 cents on something controversial for the moment. Now, the same goes for the COVID stuff. If you just go out there and bring up something from Telegram with a obviously doctored picture, that's not evidence. Going, Fauci was a Nazi, not evidence, unless you can show a non-photoshopped actual picture of him with Hitler, which probably doesn't exist because, well, this whole age thing.
There's a bit of a temporal divergence there.
Yes, Fauci's not a vampire. He doesn't live that long. But don't go into him being a vampire. Just go into whether you think he's a lying scumbag and give evidence. So here's where he said X. Oh, look, he contradicted himself. Here's where he said Y. Look, he contradicted himself. Then normal, rational people listen to you.
This is one thing with this COVID thing, I think, and it's happened on both sides across the whole thing, is that it's people are having, they're being appealed to through their emotions, and they believe that the thing that they feel is the science, and it's not. You know, they get shown something and it appeals to their emotions, and they get angry about it, and all of a sudden that becomes their fact that they cling to. And the reality is that that's not how science works, and that's not what facts are. And unfortunately, in the whole argument, there's actually very little room for somebody to speak up and lay down the truth, and that's what's missing. And that's not just COVID, that's across many aspects of what we're doing today. You know, look at climate science, look at you know, the way that we build our infrastructure. You know, it's just become a politicized football, and so where the outcome just ends up being someone's opinion because they think that's a fact, and that's the science now. Thank you very much.
Exactly. And I mean, this is a definite problem that we have in society at the moment. People aren't collecting evidence. They're just finding things on Twitter and treating it like it's real, or Wikipedia for that matter. It's not much better. I know it might aim you in the right direction as an initial search, but I'm sorry, go to Web of Science. Find a real journal, you know, one with peer review, and probably one with proper scientific process too, because even then it's not perfect. Look at a replicated study. Look at how this is done. I mean, don't just go out there and go appeal to authority and, hey, look, this guy's got a Nobel Prize. He said vitamin C cures the common cold. Yes, but he's a physicist. Vitamin C doesn't cure the common cold, and it doesn't matter how many physicists you get in the room, it still doesn't change the fact that vitamin C doesn't cure the common cold. And that's testable. Like, we can do double-blind tests, and this is important because we all have bias. So we have our views of what is good. What Aristotle says we're aiming for at an end. All of our goods and ends are different. And if we don't think about our bias and take them into account, then problems. So, I mean, this is areas that I'm working on. I mean, I personally have anger issues. I know that. Being attacked every day of your life could be an excuse, but it's not one that I'm going to try and rely on. It is something I work on. So screw core. No. Anyway, just being silly on that one. But the whole point here is, if we're going to actually think about this rationally, and that's the whole point of rational investigation, then we need to logically collect evidence and apply it. If we don't do that, then we can't sit there and say we have truth. If we don't look at the facts. And that doesn't mean because Trump said or Trump didn't say, or on the other side, Clinton said, or who, it doesn't matter. What politicians say shouldn't be considered truth in 99% of cases. The reality is we should be investigating these things, and that doesn't mean the typical government approach, which is trust the science. I'm sorry, you can't trust the science in the way that people say. Science is an iterative process. It is not scientism. There is no such thing as scientific consensus. There is
the whole point of science is you don't trust it. You go out yourself and you test it.
Not necessarily yourself, but you can look at the studies, look at the results, look at the methodology. Okay, so an example is in my criminal justice studies at the moment. They had a paper more recent that we had to write a review of, which I tore apart, because if you go back to the 20-year-old original data, it is completely antithetical to the results of the reanalyzed, sort of mixed in with race and gender hermeneutics that are somehow in there, version of what they've made into this. So go back, look at the actual data. What is someone saying about it? If someone's saying X and then it's quoted and quoted and quoted, go back and read the original. Look at the original data. Look at the methodologies. Don't just trust these things. So I know that means extra work, but that is part of truth. And if we're going to develop. So lots of, well, not too many comparative number of references today. There are a number of interesting comparisons. Coleman, their Pursuit of Happiness Through a Virtuous Life, Rand and Aristotle. Rand was actually a very big fan of Aristotle, although I'll argue that in some ways she got him wrong, and others she got him quite right, and some of her detractors got her very wrong. So chucked in a little bit of that as a side thing. It's a very interesting dichotomy on where she's taken it, and yeah, some things I agree with in objectivism, others I don't necessarily, but it's I respect Rand much more than I do Kant, but it's personal choice, I guess, in some ways. Okay,
can I ask one final question, Craig? Because I when I was reading this, it struck me, I couldn't help but think about the Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith. You don't have that on the list. Do you have some, like, what are your thoughts briefly, if you want to share between those two books? So
old Mr. Smith there is someone that eventually I'll get to. Okay. So unfortunately, there's too many works, and starting from, well, one side of history and working forward, puts some of these people, I've tried to chuck in a few modern, sort of more modern ones to spice it up, I guess, but it leaves a lot of things till year 2 and 3 in my plan, unfortunately. But yes, eventually I will. Although I believe to understand moral sentiments in Smith, we actually need to cover a lot of different areas first. We definitely need to cover Aristotle. We need to cover a lot of other virtue ethics foundations. And then we also need to increase what we even understand of virtue before we get there. Otherwise, I think we miss some of the subtleties and the point of Smith, and I think we don't do him justice. Is my answer to that.
Okay, that's fine with me. We'll just wait, and we'll get to it whenever you put that on the list there.
Mm-hmm. So, no, you won't be an old man, but close enough.
Okay.
I look forward to it.
No problem.
Never read Adam Smith, so it should be interesting.
There you go.
All right. Well, thank you very much, guys. That was I really enjoyed that. And I look forward to seeing you both in Slack